Hello, Artistry 2. I hope you are all doing fantastically well. I want to give you a shout out and greetings from, I'm actually in Picasso's studio. You can actually go visit this if you ever go to Paris. It's a third floor apartment. You can see right behind me then, right above where I am, that is actually him working on Demoiselles d'Avignon. Today we're going to be covering Fauvism and then one of the most important movements in the history of art, which is going to be Cubism, which we'll see actually here momentarily. I hope all of you are doing well. Let me screen share right here. There we go, and put myself up in the corner. Now, when we start looking at the right around the turn of the century, so as we move into what's called the 20th century, which basically starts in 1900, one of the dominant art movements that's going on is called Fauvism or Fauvism. I've heard both pronunciations. It goes from 1890 to 1910. And Fauvism literally translates over as wild beasts of color. So it's wild beasts because look at how they're using their color. It's very kind of building upon the work of Gauguin, who was one of Van Gogh's friends, actually in this lower right-hand corner. You'll see Matisse's take on this as well. The leader of the Fauve movement is really going to be Henri Matisse. And so the things that are going to show up that are going to show us a Fauvist style are the color from geometric shapes. That's really an idea going to be borrowed from Cézanne. And the saturated color for an emotional take on it is going to really come out of the artist Paul Gauguin. Now, the birth of modernism is generally credited to Cézanne in his art form, and which goes from, Cézanne lives from 1839 to 1906. As you can see in the upper right-hand and left-hand corners, those are two different depictions that he has of his favorite mountain. He has a nice view outside of his studio of what's called Mount Saint Victoire, Saint Victory. That's the mountain outcropping that shows up. And here you can see that pointed shape, also the pointed shape that shows up here. But what we will notice and what most of you will comment on is that this is different than Impressionist brushstrokes. And how is it different than Impressionist brushstrokes? Or the color palette that showed up during Expressionism of Van Gogh and Edvard Munch. And that is correct. So we are going to have these block-like types of colors coming in with that our ferula brush that shows up. And note, the images and the blocks of color blend in with one another. So this is what we call passage, where we don't know where the rocks are versus the houses. And as we look down here, there are some houses here. Are these houses or rocks? These greens and these browns. Are these houses or rocks in Mount Saint Victoire? We can't quite tell. And so the birth of modernism is really considered coming out of Cézanne's work. And so Cézanne both influences the Cubists in Picasso, as well as the Fauvists and Matisse. For Picasso, he's going to take the geometric shapes and the idea of objects blending one another, this idea called passage. And Matisse is going to take those blocks of color and the simplification of form for an expressionist movement. And basically what Picasso and Matisse both said about Cézanne is that he is the father of us all. And here's Cézanne's name up here, just so you can see it spelled out. Cézanne. So the father of us all in terms of modernism. Now, these artists are also big partiers. They're going out to places like the Moulin Rouge, the Moulin de la Galette. They basically, Paris has become a playground and is the central focus of all the artists around the planet. And they're going to see the Can-Can girls, some of the Can-Can girls, as well as the women of the night outside in the red light district of Paris. They are all partaking of the prostitution life. So this is also sometimes called the Age of Syphilis. And so at the Moulin de la Galette by Lautrec up here, you can see these greenish faces that are showing up. And this is an image by Van Gogh. This is one by Picasso. They are all painting about the social life of the underbelly, of the underclass, of this struggling artist movement that shows up. Now within this, they're all getting syphilis, basically from having sex with the same girls. And that would be Gauguin, Goya, Lautrec, Manet, Monet, Van Gogh, Cézanne, Matisse. We are going to have the same thing happen with Picasso later on. So artists behaving badly, drugs, this drug that they're going to have is a mildly narcotic alcoholic drink called Absinthe. They're going to have wild sex that goes on with the prostitutes, and that's going to spread the syphilis around amongst all of them. The women that they are actually having model for them are oftentimes the same women that they are actually having sex with. And as they are artists models as well as prostitutes, they're going from studio to studio. And so there's 4 steps to prepare Absinthe. First, you get this very bitter green liqueur that shows up that's grown from wormwood. That's where a little bit of the hallucinogenic element comes from. This alcohol becomes so cheap, it's much cheaper than wine. It's much cheaper than beer. So it's the cheapest alcohol that an artist can go out and get drunk on. You put a sugar cube above it, and then you slowly pour water that dissolves the sugar cube. You get this milky green mixture that the people who drink absinthe, your Picassos, your Van Goghs, shown over to the left of me, are going to be such as, they call it the green fairy gets released. So that green fairy gets released and literally can get you drunk because it's so much cheaper than anything else. Later on, they are actually going to, the wine manufacturers are going to try to outlaw this drink because the wine sales go down because people are interested in this hallucinogenic narcotic. And today, most of the narcotic or hallucinogen part has been taken out of the alcohol. You can still get this with wormwood, real wormwood in it, in places like Amsterdam. And it's an interesting experience because it is an alcohol and a slight hallucinogen at the same time. Generally, those two things don't go very well together. Now, these artists that we were talking about, the Gauguin, the Cézanne, the Matisse, the Van Gogh, they are living during one of the most fast-changing movements that we have in world history. This is the earliest 20th century. Life changed faster and more than in any other time period ever. Think about what happens in a 15-year period. We have the invention of electricity and the light bulb for commercial use. We have the invention of the car. We have the machine gun. We have the airplane, the telephone, the radio from a little bit earlier. We have the development of microscopic kind of and the understanding of what microscopic DNA looks like. We are going to have the idea of going from an icebox towards a refrigerator. We are just going to live in a much faster paced world, and the artists want to be involved. They see all this new technology, all these new techniques, and they say, why should we rely on Michelangelo as our model? There must be something in the new world that would actually push us forward. And so the artists are going to challenge all the art rules. And that really is where Picasso comes in. Most of these artworks, actually almost all of these artworks, were done within the first 15 to 20 years of the 20th century. They challenge almost every rule of art that we have seen up to now. And that first great rule breaker is really going to be Pablo Picasso. So here's an overview of Fauvism being led by Henri Matisse.
Fauvism was a French avant-garde art movement that gained recognition at the start of the 20th century.
You can see the colors used for expressionistic
a vibrant style of painting. Artists used vivid colors, sometimes by applying paint directly from their paint tubes. This wasn't as radical as graffiti or spray bomb painting, but pretty radical for back then, when any deviation from the traditional was often scrutinized.
Remember, this is very anti-academy art.
In a nutshell,
of what the government was
Fauvism
promoting.
style kept the drawing simple and exaggerated colors. The credit for establishing Fauvism goes to Henri Matisse and André Durand, who broke away from the traditional Impressionist methods and experimented with exaggerated colors. The spontaneous and subjective responses to the subjects in their artworks were expressed through bold brushstrokes and vibrant colors. Initially perceived to be gaudy and obscene, this wild approach was the inspiration behind naming themselves the Fauves, which means wild beasts in French. The story goes that at the 1905 Salon des Épaules, an exhibition for young artists in Paris, Matisse and Durand's paintings evoked an amusing response from an art critic. Upon seeing the young artist's vibrant artwork surrounding a Renaissance sculpture, the critic remarked that a Donatello was standing in the middle of wild beasts. The name was cheekily adopted by the artists who were inspired by this technique, which made Matisse the king of the wild beasts. Fauves were also inspired by post-impressionist artists in their symbolic and descriptive use of color to create new possibilities in art. Van Gogh used color to express emotion powerfully, and Gauguin's view of colors as a tool for spiritual expression inspired Fauves to adopt a freer and spontaneous technique.
And so that's what we're going to see in the work of Matisse then, who is literally the leader of, him and Durand found the movement, but Matisse is really the one who takes it over within the process. Matisse actually finds art late because he's a lawyer who found art during an illness when he is gifted a Van Gogh, and his art style and what he's been doing changes. One of his paintings was even burned at the Armory show. It was considered too wild in 1913. He is the second art and art movement to start to flatten this space. He gets his idea of flattening space from Islamic art, another non-Western culture, very similar to the way the Impressionism borrowed Japanese art, as they're going to flatten their space and get rid of the three-dimension picture window that shows up in artwork since the Renaissance. He's actually seen as a national hero because his daughter and his son are both part of the French resistance. And during Nazi occupation in World War II, Matisse is offered a ticket to go to New York, the hotbed of artistic activity. And he refuses and says, I am a Frenchman, and he stays there. Later on in his life, he actually has to live the last part of his life in a wheelchair. And so he's going to invent a new style of artwork for us that's called the cutouts, which actually some of you even have. The cover over here is the cover of your art history textbook. And he says he's very anxious in his real life. And so that anxiety, and in painting, he's much more freer within the process. He feels free and almost not anxious. So I wanted to show you an image then that talks about the cutouts, and actually Matisse making the cutouts. So here's Matisse himself. And it's nice, we're in the period where you can actually see the artist's work. But you can know it's very, very kind of deliberate. He doesn't worry too much about the forms and the shapes. It's how he's going to articulate them with the color palette later on. Because I know you've all seen these before, but once you get to cutouts, what do you do with them?
Welcome to London's Tate Modern for the must-see show of the summer.
And so this is one of the great modern art museums in the world, Tate Modern in
one of the world's
in New York.
most loved artists, Henri Matisse. In the 1940s, he invented a completely new art form, the papier découpé, or cutouts.
You see him cutting into the paper with incredible confidence, and then putting them onto the paper.
Note how the articulation of the female form behind on the art critic from Tate is.
At any point in the 20th century.
It's something we've never seen before.
Scale of grand painting.
So what he's going to add, besides the color palette from Fauvism, is later on that cutout, which is going to be the basis of patterning later on.
They were also something altogether new. And in case you're not sure where to begin, here are the 5 essential things you need to know about Matisse's colourful creations. Matisse called his technique painting with scissors. It was a sort of artistic back to basics, cutting up and collaging are things that children do when they play. But his love of cutting also went back to his own roots. Matisse came from a long line of weavers. So when he cut up paper, often using scissors identical to the ones used by tailors, he was reconnecting with his past. When Matisse first started cutting up paper, he used his technique as a simple means to an end to help him map out and plan large-scale projects. At first he was tentative, even secretive, about his new method of working. But before long, he realised the incredible potential of the cutouts. Soon he was using them for more ambitious projects, working in such a creative frenzy that he made more than 200 cutouts in less than a decade. These are great artworks, magnificent, confident, perfectly resolved. But when you get up close, you suddenly see that they're riddled with tiny pinholes. These holes provide a vital clue to their making, because while we now see these pieces of coloured paper glued down and placed under glass, they weren't originally conceived like this at all. Once Matisse had cut his paper into various shapes and sizes, he got his studio assistants to arrange them in different compositions and tack them to the wall using small pins. Then he'd recut and recombine them until he felt he got just the right balance. It was a bit like working out the pieces of a giant jigsaw puzzle. By the early 1950s, Matisse was working on an ever larger scale, with cutouts that took over whole walls, even whole rooms. His greatest project by far was the work he made for the Dominican Chapel of the Rosary in Vence, near his home. Here was a complete architectural environment: stained glass windows, ceramic tiles, even robes for the priest. It's amazing to think that Matisse's career had started in the 1890s under the influence of the Impressionists. Yet here he is at the very end of his life, pointing defiantly towards the immersive installation art of the future.
Remember, which was invented earlier on by Bernini in The Ecstasy of St. Teresa from the Baroque
We'll never know
period.
it given their vitality, but Matisse's cutouts were made in old age, from his late 60s until his death at the age of 84, and they were made under the shadow of illness and exhaustion. After a botched operation following a diagnosis of cancer, and with failing eyesight, Matisse made much of the work we see here from his wheelchair, from his bed. But the cutouts inspired him so much that he told friends this period was his second life. If he couldn't get out into the world anymore, he'd recreate that world in art, in all its colour and beauty. And now all that colour, beauty and vitality is here at the Tate. Do come and see it if you can.
And so what that ultimately artwork leads us to in the modern day world, besides the cutout artwork itself, is literally the idea of patterning. And so one of the most famous individuals for doing patterning is this contemporary artist. This is actually Kehinde Wiley. If you don't know his artwork, you soon will. He is becoming a superstar. He actually is an African-American artist, and he did the official portrait of President Obama, note with the background patterning of him sitting in a chair. That is the official national portrait of Obama, like all presidents have right when they leave office. He's also done some issues that start to challenge us with race. So here's the Black Judith taking a white Jewish woman, princess, who beheaded Holofernes to save her people. And here's an African-American doing the same thing with a white individual, with a white male, on some level talking and challenging the idea that African-Americans have never really been in charge or in authority over their own power over their own bodies. And Judith, very much as a woman, taking that back. Now, as we look at Fauvism, Proto-Cubism, let's also reflect back upon Romanticism. And so here are three different compare-contrast artworks, three of the great artworks that deal with prostitutes. Each one deals it with in different ways. And so we can ask such questions as, if you were a heterosexual male living in the 19th century or early 20th century, which of these brothels would you be most likely to go? We have the more realistic, kind of romanticized version of women laying around waiting, basically on call for you, and being able to pose in all sorts of different directions and poses. We have the individual joy of life, which probably is the happy prostitution painting you will ever see, where you have these beautiful colors of the fauve. But note, we have women actually here that are not actually in the prostitution market, but when there's no one around, they're so happy with their lives, they just dance around and frolic right on a lovely beach that's right off the ocean. And then we have the terrible, oh my goodness, what has happened to these women? Why have we kind of challenged beauty that shows up with Demoiselles d'Avignon, Women from Avignon, a city in southern France, by Picasso. Now, Picasso created Demoiselles d'Avignon the year after Matisse created Joy of Life, and they're a direct response to one another. They were rivals and they were friends. Matisse is a little bit of the older generation. He's about a decade older than Picasso, but he really does want to challenge Matisse for who should be at the forefront of the art market. He loves the idea that Matisse is challenging the market and challenging the academy, and so often goes to Matisse's openings as he's actually developing his own style. Now, Pablo Picasso today later on does challenge Matisse and come out ahead. He is generally considered the third most influential artist in human history. Behind, anyone have any guesses on who 1, 2 might be? All right, so of those three, Michelangelo would be a selection, Da Vinci would be selection, and we have another one that's going to be added in next week, Marcel Duchamp, who basically does the toilet or the fountain. He is actually one of the few artists on the planet that is claimed by 2 different countries, and that's because of his prolific period. His early life, he's born in Spain and lives there until he's about 15. Then he travels actually for more of a collegiate education in Paris, and very seldom actually ever returns, particularly for working. And so he is a Spanish by birth artist, but really practicing in the dominant cultural artistic city in the world, which happens to be Paris, almost his entire life. His blue period over here on the left-hand side is sponsored once he first moves to Paris, and that's largely because one of his best friends, who is also an artist, Casagemas, actually commits suicide, and that puts what we believe Picasso in a very spiral period where he creates very dark, morose, using blue. When once asked why he was using blue during this period, Picasso later replied, not about depression, but I had already had blue paint. I didn't have to buy anything else. The blue period paintings do not sell very well. And so if you ever get up close online, and this is called The Blind or The Old Guitarist, if you look at a high resolution image, you'll see there's another painting underneath. The first painting never sold. And so rather than Picasso actually just throwing the painting out, he reused the canvas and eventually he sold this to the Art Institute of Chicago. He's constantly womanizing with girlfriends and prostitutes, which does mean he is going to have to worry about syphilis throughout his career. And later on during the World War II, the Nazis are going to destroy much of his art. They call it degenerate art because it's not like the classical models that Hitler and the Nazis are promoting. It's this degenerate, partly sexual prostitute-based art. Now, here's a video that you can watch if you so choose. I'm actually not going to go through this one today because knowing it's in the PowerPoint. But here's some 10 interesting facts that show up about Picasso. We will cover most of those throughout kind of talking about Cubism as it is.
What two artists and Greek we certainly have in common. They are both fear. Here is number one of the greatest artworks that has fear.
Thank you, Professor Snape from Hogwarts. I hope that you are doing well. So this is one of the artworks that changed the world. This is Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon from 1905-1906, and is one of the most revolutionary artworks in all of human history. It really is a remarkable tour de force. And part of the reason of that remarkability, first off, Picasso calls it my brothel. It's his women. And as I'll show you a slide in a moment, Picasso paints this in the nude only at nighttime. And so his friends, when they find out about his working condition during the time period, they actually put him on a suicide watch, like Matisse. They are afraid, A, he's actually making fun of art because art has never looked like this before. Or number two, he is actually starting to go insane and lost his marbles. So here's what I'd like you to spend some time doing. Picasso, when he goes to create this artwork, Demoiselles d'Avignon, sets upon the path of early 20th century artists, a young, brash student who had just learned art schools, just graduated from the academy. He had all of his skill sets, he was ready to paint. But he wanted to challenge everything about academic art. He wanted to challenge everything about early or late 19th, early 20th century art. So I'd like you to come up with 15 to 20 different challenges to art that are in this painting. And I will pause for a minute so you can pause the video, but then we'll walk through some of the changes like we did in class. First off, he's going to challenge beauty standards. These are not traditionally beautiful women in any way, shape, or form. In fact, some of them are hideous. If you look at how their masks and how the masks have been distorted. He's going to use geometric simplified forms, and part of that comes out of the abstraction that Cézanne was playing with. He is the first artist to actually use African art now, so these primitive African people, or primitive Black African people. If you can recall, and maybe you cannot, but at the turn of the 20th century, around 1900, African Americans, even though they were free, were treated atrociously in the United States and other parts of the world. They were still seen as subhuman. The civil rights movement had not happened. We didn't even really have Jim Crow laws that were separating out yet. There was basically just two absolutely separate people. And African Americans, unless they were serving white people, generally were not around the white communities at all. You notice the background, the middle ground and the background are going to blend. The women with the African masks over here on this side of the painting have their head ripped off. And this woman in particular, her head ripped off and actually put on backwards. So they're going to get rid of all the things we saw from the Renaissance about the picture window. The one-point perspective, the atmospheric perspective, the trompe-l'oeil, the foreshortening, chiaroscuro, even the fruit down here, which is traditionally a symbol of female sexuality, right? We talk about a woman's cherry being her virginity, talk about a woman's melons in reference to her breast. That is a watermelon, a grape, a pear, and an apple that no one should want to taste. And so on some of it's a reference to bad sexuality. There's something wrong with these women. Art history critique, if you look at this particular image over here, note, this particular image is a kind of a composite image to make fun of all of art history up until that point. That woman has the features and has the muscularity of Eve from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. It's got a composite pose and face, Mesopotamia. Note how her eye is actually shifted out of perspective and looked directly on you, like we saw a composite pose in both Egypt and Mesopotamia. Her body's got multiple colors, so he's making fun of both Van Eyck, who did that initially, just with much more beautiful blending. And Da Vinci, who invented chiaroscuro, as you can see in different aspects with the Cezanne. And we haven't seen this yet, but Iberian sculpture, which is basically Roman-inspired Spanish sculpture from the time period, is what this head is. And that's one of the reasons why it's basically a different color. So he's basically trying to challenge all the rules of art. Here's the problem for Picasso. He doesn't know, because he's challenged so many different rules, which ones are the one that make this painting successful, and which ones are the one that can be discarded again because they were not that impactful. He needs an outside voice. And so later on, for the development of Cubism, this is considered proto-Cubism, right before Cubism, he needs another artist to help him along that process. And that artist that's going to help him as suited is an artist named Georges Braque. And they jointly are going to invent Cubism. From Demoiselles d'Avignon, here's what Picasso says, and that's Picasso over on the left, standing in front of his own African art collection. Men had made those masks as a kind of meditation between themselves and the unknown hostile forces that surround them. Painting is a way of seizing power by giving form to our terrors as well as our desires. And so here, so we talked about him being a womanizer, loving sex, whether it's with a prostitute, whether it's with his wife, whether it's with his girlfriends, often that he had all at the same time, passing syphilis back and forth. Yes, you have these desires, that sexual urge, but you also have the idea of terror. And the idea of terror is the fact that Pablo Picasso actually had VD the year before he painted this picture. Before he got VD, from what we can see, venereal disease, syphilis, these women had more normalized faces. Then, while he got syphilis and was experiencing some of the problems that go along with it, he went to an African art exhibit, the first one ever in the Western world, at the Trocadero Art Museum. There he bought these two masks that he had kept in his collection all the way until his death in the 1970s. And you'll note they're very direct geometric abstractions that show up here. Pablo Picasso, as I mentioned, called it his brothel. And he was put on suicide watch while creating the painting because he was doing it nude and only at night. And his friends were a little weirded out by the process, as a good friend might be. Now, here's actually a video that does really well showing you how these non-Western, basically these non-white Christian cultures have impacted our art. Whether that's Islamic art coming out of Matisse, whether that's the African art in terms of Picasso, whether it's Japanese print in terms of Van Gogh, or Van Gogh and the other Impressionists. They were willing to look at other cultures with something to say.
The term modern art sounds like it means art that is popular at the moment. But in fact, modern art is a style that originated over 150 years ago and includes artists that by now have attained classic status, such as Picasso, Matisse, and Gauguin.
And remember, all starting with Cezanne.
What's more ironic is that the movement they pioneered, considered revolutionary and even scandalous at the time, was inspired largely by an object of a traditional and ancient design. As far back as the Renaissance, the primary European art movements emphasized conventional representation and adherence to classical forms.
And this is the Hans Holbein from the English Renaissance.
Century, as artists like Van Gogh and Cezanne expanded the boundaries of painting. Soon, a movement arose that sought to create an entirely new style of art. And one way of doing so was to look beyond Western civilization. For example, Paul Gauguin moved to the island of Tahiti in the 1890s. There, he found inspiration in the island's inhabitants, landscape, and culture to create artwork that intertwined European themes and Polynesian lore. Others looked to the cultures of the Islamic world, but the most influential inspiration would come from sub-Saharan Africa. As European empires expanded deeper into the African continent, its artifacts and artworks made their way into the hands of museums and collectors. One such collector was Henri Matisse, who showed his friend Picasso a mask he had acquired, made by the Dan tribe of the Ivory Coast. The mask awoke Picasso's curiosity, leading him to visit the Trocadero Ethnographic Museum in Paris in 1907. Founded to house acquisitions from colonial conquests, the museum boasted a collection of African art, with stylized figures and masks made of wood and decorated with simple colors and materials. The visit was a revelation for Picasso, who proclaimed that African masks were what painting was all about. At this time, Picasso had been working on a painting of 5 nude women in a style that would later come to be known as Cubism. And while 3 of these ladies show facial features found in ancient Iberian art, a nod to Picasso's Spanish heritage, the faces of the 2 on the right closely resemble African masks. Created in 1907, after hundreds of sketches and studies, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon has been considered the first truly 20th century masterpiece, breaking with many previously held notions in art. It was at once aggressive and abstract, distorted yet primal in its raw geometry, a new artistic language with new forms, colors, and meanings. And these avant-garde qualities caused a sensation when the painting was first exhibited almost 10 years later. The public was shocked, critics denounced it as immoral, and even Picasso's own friends were simultaneously surprised, offended, and mesmerized at his audacity. More artists soon followed in Picasso's footsteps. Constantin Brancusi and Amedeo Modigliani in Paris, as well as the German Expressionists, all drew on the aesthetics of African sculptures in their work. Others looked to a different continent for their inspiration. British sculptor Henry Moore based many of his semi-abstract bronze sculptures on a replica of a Chak Mool, a distinctive reclining statue from the Toltec Maya culture. Pre-Columbian art was also a major influence for Joseph Albers. He created a series of compositions, such as the geometrical series, Homage to the Square, that were inspired by pyramids and local art he encountered on his frequent visits to Mexico. Inspiration from ancient cultures initiated one of the most revolutionary movements in art history, but were these artists playing the role of explorers or conquistadors, appropriating ideas and profiting from cultures they considered primitive? Questions like this deserve scrutiny as artists continue to redefine standards. Perhaps not too long from now, the bold innovations of modern art will seem like stale orthodoxies, ready to be overturned by a new set of radical trailblazers drawing inspiration from another unlikely source.
And so one of your final exam questions that is very likely to show up is, how did these non-Western cultures influence not just modern art, but art before that? Whether we're looking at Oceanic, Latin American, African art, we could look at the Japanese and the Chinese traditions that show up. And one of the quotes that show up then about Picasso in this particular artwork is this. He basically says, "To paint is to destroy." And that was one of his comments from 1908. Early on, there were a number of prep. As I said, there's 100 different prep. And note how the message changes. In some of the early sketches, there is a medical student and a sailor, right? The medical student literally about coming in to check to find out if the women do have venereal disease before clients come in. The sailor, symbol for cheap sex if he's here on, before shipping out again, and he wants to have a good time with some women before going out. And here is actually those women that were, some of the women that were actually the model for Demoiselles d'Avignon, actually prostitutes that are working in one of his favorite local brothels. Now, as we come through, we've got to look at a Cubism overview.
The Cubist movement challenged age-old artistic styles and rejected conventional ideas. These artists wanted to revitalize art so that it would be more in line with the modern age. They would go on to create the first abstract style in modern art. The Cubist movement reached its creative peak between 1907 and 1914, and it continues to influence artists to this day. At the turn of the 20th century, artists found themselves in a fast-paced and ever-changing modern world. Technological advances, political changes, and dramatic changes within social structures were all happening at this time. Photography was increasingly being used for portraiture and to document historical and everyday events, so it was only natural for painters to turn to other themes. The leading artists of the day, Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, felt that a new artistic style was needed to connect with a modern audience and reflect the struggles of modern life. Inspired by post-impressionist Paul Cézanne, Cubist artists deviated from the three-dimensional perspective that had been the norm in art since the Renaissance. They instead painted two-dimensional figures from multiple perspectives to convey a sense of totality in a uniquely modern way. Cubist artists simplified natural forms into geometric shapes like cylinders, spheres, and of course cubes. The movement got its name from a French critic who, upon viewing Braque's 1908 landscape paintings, commented on the liberal use of cubes. Cubists had a new approach to painting time, volume, mass, and space. Instead of attempting to duplicate images, Cubists attempted to distill the essence of their subjects with abstract forms. For example, instead of painting a breakfast table as a three-dimensional flat surface topped with realistic dishes, Juan Gris' Breakfast depicts a fragmented table, complete with fragmented, multicolored dishes with wallpaper spilling onto both. This invites viewers to contemplate not the beauty or reality of the scene, but the essence or feeling of a breakfast table set with dishes. Common characteristics seen in Cubist paintings and sculpture are the liberal use of geometric forms, distorted and fragmented objects, and multiple perspectives of the same scene. The Cubist...
And that's kind of one of the things that we'll emphasize here in a moment, is that I'll actually show you the various features, the aesthetic features of Cubism, some of them that were actually talked about in the video, but where the Cubists are coming from. And so what we want to do is actually look at the difference as Cubism develops. So in 1905, 1906, we have Demoiselles d'Avignon right here in the middle, which is generally considered proto-Cubism. That is eventually going to develop into really a more scientific look at the world, and that's analytic Cubism over here from 1909. And eventually that's going to develop into how do we relayer and build these aspects up to make synthetic Cubism. So the question for all of you to consider then is, what do these three styles actually share? Because that gives us the essence of what Cubism looks like. And Cubist aesthetics then are going to be the following. So first off, they're going to eliminate the Renaissance picture window, and there's going to be no vanishing point. This artwork is actually going to deny depth as best it can. There's not going to be chiaroscuro. There's not going to be one-point perspective, atmospheric perspective, trompe-l'oeil. We're not going to have any of that. We're going to build subjects up from direct observation. If I see a triangle on the nose, I'm going to put a triangle on the nose. We're going to change in shifting perspective, and this is the hard one. So for example, if you look at Demoiselles d'Avignon, the shifting perspective is very strange because the woman all the way here on the left, you note the brown bottom, she's standing up against a wall with her hand up in the air, pressed up against that wall. But then as you come down and see the next two women, those next two women are laying on a bed. So now in the same picture, you're looking down at two women on the bed offering themselves their sexual services at a brothel. Then the next two women that are sitting up are actually back up. And so you have shifting perspectives within the exact same artwork. We're going to have a simplification of colors, as you can see, particularly in analytic Cubism, and then moving to synthetic Cubism, to where we go to monochromatic one color. We're going to have the simplification of geometric forms and curvilinear lines. There's not going to be highly detailed. We're going to have passage of objects into another. This is a portrait of Daniel Kienwaller. Don't worry about the name right now. That happens to be Picasso's art dealer. If you note, there's one nose, there's another nose, there's another nose, there's a mustache, there's a mustache, there's a chin, there's a chin, there's a chin. They all blend together from shifting perspective. And finally, if you break down the form this much, the subject matter is not going to matter. The subject matter becomes much more incidental to the artistic practice. And as such, they're going to borrow the ideas, as we mentioned before. It's the same slide as before now, that we've gone through Cézanne a little bit, talking about the geometric shapes and the passage of forms blending together versus the Matisse areas. So what we're looking at then is Cubism is the following. It's the simplification of form which they're borrowing from Cézanne. They're going to create what artists see rather than the viewer. That's the new idea here. And finally, they're going to take passage also from Cézanne, that objects in three-dimensional space might overflow one another, where you can't tell where one begins and one ends. So that's what we're going to have you do. The two people that are actually going to co-develop this, one is going to be Georges Braque, Braque's name's up here, B-R-A-Q-U, and Picasso co-developed Cubism from Demoiselles d'Avignon. Picasso is generally given all the credit because he moves on and is the leader of almost every artistic movement from here on out. He's not the person who invents Surrealism, but when Surrealism takes hold, he sees the new way that this art can do, and he moves on to Surrealism. And he does that multiple times because he lives all the way until the 1970s. Georges Braque stops making art really about 1920 and dies pretty young. Co-development of Cubism by Picasso is so significant that people actually have spoofed it as the Wright brothers. They literally were visiting each other's studios every day to give each other critical feedback. And so to show you, we have Braque on the top, Picasso on the bottom for early Cubism and analytic Cubism, to show you how similar is Picasso within it. So Picasso is one of the most spoofed artists of all time. Here we see him at the doctor's office. There's nothing wrong with you. You're a Picasso, because the body forms are rearranged. And of course, the spoof that shows up of the three musicians, a later surrealist Cubist piece. The other art movement then that Cubism directly leads to, which we have to discuss at least in minimal part today, is Futurism. So I want to show you the overview of Futurism. It starts from about 1909 and goes to 1930. Note, right during World War I.
Sleek machines, objects falling from space, vibrant color, all these are aspects that
note the impact that Matisse's cutouts have on that.
Italian Futurism, a show on at the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. Italian Futurism was a revolutionary artistic movement that was begun in 1909 by a poet called Filippo Tommaso Marinetti.
He called himself the caffeine of Europe.
Vocal man, an Italian who liked to call himself the caffeine of Europe. It was an idea that was born in the tinderbox social climate of Italy at the beginning of the 20th century.
To be futurist was in Italy in the teens and 20s, to be modern, to be insurgent. Futurism meant dynamism, simultaneity, speed, the embrace of the machine in the modern industrial city, and a rejection of everything in the past.
Futurist art was bought by American collectors, but a real retrospective of the movement has never been put on in America. This new show aims to prove that futurists were at the forefront of the avant-garde and had as much of an impact on modernism as their neighbors in France.
Now, one of the things that shows up is they absolutely do have this monument and this impact of all the French aspect. And that is the one issue that shows up, though, and you should be scared anytime ever anyone says, hey, I have a manifesto for you to read. So this is the Caffeine of Europe, Filippo Marinetti's manifesto. It is from Italy that we launched through the world this violently upsetting, incendiary manifesto of ours. With it today, we establish Futurism because we want to free this land from its smelly gangrene of professors and antiquarians. We mean to free her from the numberless museums that cover her like so many graveyards. Museums, cemeteries. Do you wish to waste all of your best powers in this eternal and futile worship of the past? Lift up your heads. And so as we go through, you'll see they really want to destroy everything. These are the individuals at the beginning that believe that only the stuff that is new, the speed, the modern, the machine, the railway, the plane, the machine gun, that's where true art is. You want to go back and look at a Michelangelo or a Da Vinci? Gangrene, right? It's choking us because we don't have the talent to do it anymore, but also who would want to do it when we have speed and all these new things that we're learning? Note number 9. This is going to be the key one for us. We will glorify war, the world's only hygiene. Hygiene meaning literally something that cleans out everything else. Militarism and scorn for women. These are the artists on some level that are going to be at the forefront when World War I breaks out. They relish World War I because World War I means a destruction of the stuff that was in the past, a destruction of the social order. And what do? We get to use all of our great machines that we haven't been able to use. We've got tanks and planes and machine guns. Number 10, we will destroy the museums, libraries, and academies of every time, killing professors. That's what they want to do. So the question is, if this is so much about the future, how would you illustrate the future manifesto in art? And remember, here are quotes: violence, death to the academy, male dominance, feminism is anti-masculine or anti-man, speed, scorn for women, and museums are cemeteries. So how do you make an artwork that's about that? And here's what they do. They try to show emotion. They try to show objects that are actually moving. So on the left is nude descending a staircase. Note, it's kind of like the My Bridge, multiple different serial photographs of someone moving, but note a very machine-like body. You really can't tell the difference if that's male or female. And the other one is on the right, this masculine, hyper-masculine, man ripping forward with muscles and flames ripping off, helmet head that shows up, called The Unique Continuity of Forms in Space by Boccioni. So they're both absolutely Cubist style, but they want a Cubist style with a subject matter that mattered. And that subject matter should be about speed, should be about power, should be about modernity. And they got what they asked for. 20 million casualties. And these artists, as well as the philosophers that are promoting futurism, are at the forefront of promoting this philosophy and this destruction. So we have this wonderful new world that no one had ever thought about. Oh, well, if I have machine guns, someone else might have machine guns. Oh, if I have military planes, no one thought that just because they had it and were going to use it, that other people would also use it on them. And so they were absolutely shocked when they saw the destruction in the aftermath of World War I and then later on in World War II. This is what the aftermath of that idea of promoting futurism is, and letting go of everything from the past, which include moral standards. And as such, the artists were mortified at the end of World War I. Even during World War I, they realized the enormous mistake they had made. And so new styles of art are going to have to emerge. They are Cubist influence, but they are trying to do something that is really, that's not going to offend anyone. That's not going to harm anyone. That's not going to be anti-religious, anti-political. They go to this aspect of what really is abstraction. So two individuals, in particular, the most important one that we'll talk about here is going to be Constantin Brancusi, who goes through this futurist phase, almost futurism as like leading us towards space travel, leading us toward cyborgs and the way that people interact. Note you have the Kiss, beautiful little image that's kind of very Cubist inspired from 1907, 1908. Note very similar to the Despicable Me Minion characters. This is one of the artworks they were using when they started designing those characters. They really liked Brancusi. And so this does have an impact later on. This futurist aesthetic is going to show up in the modern day world as well. The most famous neo-futurist or futurist of the modern day world, now not promoting death and destruction anymore, really promoting the aesthetic of that high sheen mechanical image that shows up, is Anish Kapoor. So he has a future machine aesthetic without the politics. His most famous artwork is Cloud Gate, or called The Bean in Chicago, where you walk up and as you get closer, it flips you. So you all of a sudden become upside down like the city around it. And his most famous quote then is that artists make mythologies. Artists create worlds that we want to live in or that we fear living in that's different than our own. And this is all going to lead to modernist architecture. I mean, let's face it. Look at the Empire State Building seen right here. That is basically Cubism in a building. The same way with the Guggenheim Museum. These are all impacts that are going to show up. We also have the cantilever design that shows up here. Yes, it's embedded within nature, but that is still highly Cubist design, even when the Eiffel Tower was being built. Here's what people and artists said about the Eiffel Tower while it was being built. Generally considered one of the most beautiful buildings today, giving you a beautiful view over all of Paris. Here's what artists said as they sound the document. This tower dominating Paris, like a gigantic and black factory chimney, crushing with its barbarous mass, Notre Dame. All our monuments humiliated. Why? Because no other building looked like this. This looked like what factories looked like that people went, and they hated that architecture at the time. All our monuments humiliated. And for 20 years, that's the contract it was given as a radio tower. Years we shall see stretching over the entire city, the odious shadow of the odious column built up of riveted plate. And that was 10,000 people signed that petition to stop the building of the Eiffel Tower before the World's Fair in the 1880s. And then later on, because it was such a communication status, remember, this becomes the tallest building in the world, now surpassing the lovely Great Pyramids at Giza. It took us that long and a new technology to get there. So it symbolized French industrial progress, first building over 1,000 feet tall, man-made. The shape was wind resistant. All these new features had to come up with. And so coming out of the Cubist movement, look at the modern architectural features here. Technological machine aesthetic, rejection of ornament, simplification of form, elimination of unnecessary detail, adoption of express structure, and that concept all the way at the bottom, which may be cut out, is form follows function. This is basically Cubism only in buildings as it shows up in modern architecture. And so here's the history of the tallest buildings in the world. Once we develop these lovely features, we actually never get rid of them. You'll notice tallest building for the vast part of human history, almost 4,000 years, is the Great Pyramid. Then everything else has been about a 40-year window. We'll see how long Burj Khalifa in Dubai lasts. How does Cubism impact modern architecture? Look at the Cubist aesthetics. There we have the portrait of Daniel Kienwaller from Picasso. There's no vanishing point, changing, shifting perspective as you move around, simplification of the geometric form. Subject matter becomes incidental in the building. You don't know what building is what for what, which one of these buildings is a bank and which one is from an apartment complex. Build subjects from direct observation, simplification of forms, monochrome, passage of objects into one another. You can't tell which window is which for which floor. So we are going to borrow a lot of these things in modern day architecture. So Cubism is going to have an enormous feel. And one of the things that shows up with the international style then, this geometric footprint, is this. Once it gets invented, it dominates the planet. In the aftermath of World War II, when we have to do a lot of mass building, because we've destroyed a lot of the earlier buildings, look how the architecture, whether you're in Paris in the right, or in Nairobi or Hong Kong, or Miami, Florida, it kind of all looks the same. Each country then kind of loses its character when we go to an international style. Everything looks the same. And that's one of the negative aspects of this style of architecture. Empire State Building, it looks like all the other buildings, it just happens to be more beautiful and taller. Here's the idea of the Empire State Building, which was the tallest building in the world for about 40 years, till the Sears Tower took it up. It was actually finished during the Great Depression, so it was called the Empty State Building. And if you look at a couple things, they're amazing. 10,000 people an hour can be moved by the elevators. They built it at a rate of 4.5 floors per week. One of the most famous artworks is men just having lunch on one of the giant girders, 1,000 feet in the air. The Empire State Building also holds a Guinness Book of World Record because it was actually hit by a bomber. It set in a fire in the 79th floor, and 13 people died, 26 people were hurt. And the Guinness World Record is a woman fell in an elevator from 79 floors and survived. This is her coming out. That's the longest elevator fall we've ever had in world history, still today. And then today we move to modern architecture, where we still have the geometric form, except we're going to put it in terms of nature. We're going to make it flow. We're going to make it much more organic. And so the most famous one is Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright, where he actually built a waterfall that runs through your basement. So all day long, you actually hear the flow of running water. It's gorgeous. And so these are his different models. If they're on the prairie, they're long like the prairie. If they're in the desert, they take a desert color and hue landscape that shows up. And the most famous then today, quickly through architecture, is this. This is an individual challenging that idea of architecture. This is called decon or deconstructivist architecture. It basically is using stability versus non-stability of structure, dynamics, what forms. With the invention of the computer and the mathematical formulas allow you to do this. And so Frank Gehry is probably the leading architect in the world today. And so we have some in Miami, we have some in New York, they're in LA. And no, each one appears like the structure started to fall apart or like they're not finished in some capacity. So here, when you get up close to the Disney concert hall sponsored by Disney, the aerial view of this makes it look like Mickey Mouse's head is basically unfurling in front of you. And so each of this has a deconstructivist. So they're still using some of the Cubist forms, but it's a very playful way of playing around with these. So as we wrap up, what are 10 ways that Fauvism and Cubism impact our art today? I'll give you a moment or two to think about those. But what I'd like you to do is pause the video and think about it on your own. Try to reflect. I'll give you a second, then I'll show you the answers. 10 possible ways the primitivism is going to be celebrated, from Islam from Africa. Artist as a cultural critic. Artist has a social responsibility. We're going to abstract color, line, and form for the first time. We're going to make the subject matter not that important. Constructive sculpture is going to be invented, Picasso's guitar, based upon African art. New art forms like the cutouts and the collage, thank you very much, Matisse. International style of architecture in the rebuilding of World War II, when we try to build everything up and get it stylized all across the planet. We're going to rule break directly leads us to World War I. Thank the futurists for that. And patterning in art from Matisse. So these are 10 main ways that Fauvism and Cubism and the redirected movements come out of that. I hope that went well and everything. You don't have any questions. If you do, drop me a line. Let me know. Have a wonderful day. Bye.